sometimes Christians that are involved with some form of justice work are kind of seen as really progressive or something at the minute, by more conservative folks, and yet if we get truly conservative and go back to the Old Testament, like, we just see that God has always been on the side of the widow and the orphan, right, and the stranger and the oppressed.
Yeah.
And so it runs through the law of Moses and with Jesus kind of readdressing, giving his like State of the Union speech, if you like, on the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of it invites us into that way of life again, where we have to take care of human beings that are made in the image of God as well.
You're listening to Justice Matters with Tim Buxton, a podcast inspiring the fight for a world where everyone belongs. Well, welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Stu G. He is the lead guitarist for the famous band Delirious. Mate, this was a band that I grew up on. I love them. It's a highlight, really, to be able to talk with Stu. Now, in part 1, we talk about the Beatitudes project that he founded. In this episode, though, however, we pick things up when Stu and I are talking about how to engage with, how to serve and understand and learn from those that are different to us. We discuss issues of interfaith dialogue, and really, we really go into our own personal experiences. Guys, it really was a highlight to have Stu on the podcast, and I'm just so thankful that I get to share my conversation that I had with him, with you. I was getting in the flow, knowing I was coming in early this morning to chat with you, and I was listening to I kind of thought, well, what kind of theme do I want to kind of go into work in? And I was listening to the Troublemakers section, where you've got propaganda and also Martin Smith. Yeah. Martin Smith kind of doing that kind of piece, and getting that edgy justice kind of hat on, like we're gonna talk about, some of this stuff, as we can see, you've got to get your hands dirty. Justice work, is more than just advocacy in one. It's a lifestyle, and it requires you, I think, to kind of put the gloves on, get down and dirty and do some hard work and digging. I think right now we're finding, I'm finding that there's a lot of that hard work and digging for me personally, and maybe I'd like to get some of your reflections on this, has been in this realm of actually, how am I colluding? How am I part of the systems that are in place in our society, which are being kind of brought into light, and rightly so right now? How am I? And I love how throughout even the album, you've got these interludes of listen.
Yeah.
Because, we can see injustice, and we can want to just jump on and get on the side that we think is fighting right and get into it. But yeah, those moments of maybe the hard work, the troublemaking needs to kind of really happen in reflection internally first, I think, before we can go out. What's this season been like for you? We got just so much pain in our society. And even now in the West, we've seen it in I've seen it in Iraq up front, the worst that you can see. But right now it's kind of confronting all of us in some real visual ways. What's it been like for you, reflecting on the season that we're at right now?
Yeah, I have a lot of friends on both sides of the spectrum, And so it's a very conflicting time at times, because the noise that comes from our screens into our brains is huge, and
Filtered.
it leaves you thinking, well, what, yeah, like, what can I, should I say something or should I not? Like, when is it time to speak up? When is it time to stay quiet? And yeah, gosh, I mean, it's very difficult to know how to be. And so, do people want my opinions, or do they want to see me living life differently? And so I think that's where I'm going, is that how we live and how we love, like, is the greatest apologetic. We can make so much noise and be full of knowledge, but are we actually living any different? So that's been the challenge for me. Is how do I stay connected to the things that matter to me, in terms of the justice work or the advocacy, because with the Beatitudes Project, for instance, you've potentially got more than 8 kind of things that you could be doing. Like, honestly, that'd be too much. One of the big things for me in the project that I haven't mentioned yet is about interfaith dialogue. So, when it came to the meek chapter, we classically, meekness has been viewed as a virtue, in terms of, like, well, it's perhaps when you have power under control, and you're kind of more humble, right? But we wanted to look at it a little bit differently and say, well, what about those that have been humbled or humiliated? Like, what about the people who have been trodden into the earth? What about the people who've had power taken away from them? And one of my great friends in the project is a guy called Rabbi Joseph Edelheit. And I spent some time with him and in conversation with him. And we came up with this phrase of meekness as those whose presence is ignored. And
wow, that hits home. Yeah,
those whose presence is ignored. So, living in the southern states of America, there's obviously there's the race conversation, right? And so I spent time with the African American community in Franklin, descendants of slaves. As a white English man, like, you can't get any more white than me, honestly. So I was, I wanted to know what life was like for those friends, and then I spent time with religious Muslims. What's it like growing up in America in the age of ISIS and in the post 9/11? And they're like hot topics, right? Yeah. But people whose presence we ignore could be the elderly neighbor. Like, what about the elderly? What about the mentally handicapped or the physically disabled? We ignore so many people. So that is one area of what I discovered when I was doing the Beatitudes Project that is really important to me, and I want to make sure that I'm carrying on with some interfaith dialogue. Where my first instinct isn't I need to convert anyone, but my first instinct is how can I be a good neighbor? And what does that look like? A good neighbor, when someone moves into their house, will knock on the door and say, is there anything you need?
Yeah.
Would you like a coffee while you're moving in? Or something like that, right? And a neighbor doesn't say, you're going to hell.
Right. No, they don't. Not a good one. That's not going to get things off to a good start.
That's right. So it's informed, the project has informed me at this time into wanting to stay in touch with the things that have been important to me along the journey, like interfaith dialogue, like my friend Shane Claiborne, who is an activist and a preacher and a pastor and author and what have you. I stay in touch with him regularly. He tries to get me into all kinds of good trouble. And, there's some things that I can say yes to, and there's some things that my immigration lawyer wouldn't like. So,
totally. So, I can get that tension, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Or your wife, maybe, as well.
That's right. Yeah.
Justice Matters is brought to you by You Belong. If you'd like to learn more about their work, empowering refugees to integrate and thrive in Australia, head on over to youbelong.org.au. There you'll find ways to get involved, volunteer, and financially get behind the several initiatives they've got going on. There's also a stack of articles and blogs that you'll find there that are really informative and engaging. Now, did you know this podcast is actually a video podcast featured on YouTube? Just search Justice Matters TV on YouTube and watch each episode right there. And while you're there, hit subscribe and get notified each time a new video drops. Hey.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up something I think really important, which is this idea of how do we treat the other, the different, not just obviously the meek, and their circumstances and their experiences, in a particular way, in their powerlessness, the way they're ignored and overlooked, but the other in general, like you said, those that are just have a different faith and belief system or have experience. I mean, I think that's a profound, it's a really important thing that we really address right now. How do we treat people that are different to us? How do we listen to someone whose views or ideas about God or ideas about the suffering and the pain and the issues that are really important to everyday life? Just, how do we listen to people? How do we treat the other? I think it's a really, really important thing.
Yeah, I think that it takes a little bit of risk, and it takes effort on our part to go towards the people who perhaps we don't know or haven't spent time with, or we don't know their story. It's not just about them coming to us to help us understand. We have to go and meet them. And so there's real effort there. And then, the idea of dialogue. So this is another Rabbi Joseph thing. He talks about engagement is greater than tolerance. So
I like that. Oh man, you've said some great little one-liners.
Well, they're not mine. I just remember them. But the idea that, because even the sound of the word tolerant is kind of harsh. I tolerate you. But
I'll put up with you.
I'll put up with you. Like engagement is, and he has a great example. So he started a orphanage in rural India for kids who were all orphaned by HIV and were HIV positive themselves. So they had to have clean water to take their retroviral drugs,
Yeah.
and clean water in rural India is very difficult to
Hard to
find.
find. Wow.
Yeah, so he was doing a talk at he was presenting a paper at Oxford University and on science and religion. And his thing was, forget what we disagree about. Here's what I need. I need clean water in rural India. Will you help me as a scientist? Will you help me do that? And that's an example of like, how do we engage rather than, tolerate someone over there doing their thing, And so, which is why we asked the question, what does it mean to listen right at the beginning?
Yes.
Because,
I loved it.
until we hear people's stories, it's very difficult to put a human face on our neighbor. They're just a statistic up until that point, or someone that we see in the news.
Yeah.
And for instance, with the Muslim conversation, I know that a lot of people are very wary of the Muslim faith, and it just comes from what's portrayed on TV and on news screens about ISIS or whatever, or 9/11, and we forget that it's currently the fastest growing religion in the world. And, if it was a religious war, the whole world would be at war.
Right.
Right. We forget that there are people who just want to live in peace.
Yeah.
And want to look after their families.
Yeah.
Oh,
and you make me think of my neighbors in Iraq.
Yeah.
99% of them Muslim. They were our closest friends. They took care of us. They protected us. They made meals for us, invited us into their home. I mean, you probably will not get better hospitality and love. And here I am, my wife and my wife's from New York, I'm from Australia, but we both held American passports in a country that had, from their perspective, whether it be on their behalf or not, had invaded and had involved in a military way, and yet their love and graciousness and kindness towards us was nothing but mind-boggling, really. And I think you're right.
That's amazing.
That's the story. That's what needs to make the news feed. That's what needs to kind of be filling our hearts. And I think what happens is when we do encounter the other or the different that we've maybe been taught to be afraid of, we double down, right? Like you said, instead of, we double down our defenses of why we're right and why we're this, or instead of, like you said, we've got to push out and engage. We've got to step forward. Maybe just into their living room and have a cup of tea. Talk about football or something. And realize,
that's right.
That, like you said, we've all got the same dreams and aspirations for our families, to live in peace, to get an education, to you follow their dreams. It's beautiful. And I, again, that idea of listening, that idea of going in first to learn. We have values for the charity I started here in Australia, You Belong, which is what this podcast is associated with. And the first values are we unconditionally love, right? It's a lot of L's in the values. So there's no strings attached. There's no agenda to this love. It's just unconditional love and elaborate hospitality. And then we want to listen. We just want to have a posture of just listening to their stories, listening to their experiences. These are families that have experienced incredible trauma, torture, suffering, loss, grief, pain, trying to start their life again. They need to be listened. And in that process, I need to learn. Not just learn about their stories, but learn from them with the posture of humility that actually, I've got something to learn from you. The minute we think, again, we get into this double down, how can I get them to think what I think? Well, how about we first just have a humility to say, maybe there's something you've got to teach me. I mean, it's sad that it's become such a difficult posture to take these days, but I think it's so important and just etched again in this idea of the Beatitudes, the upside down, back to front way.
No, that's right. And I think, sometimes Christians that are involved with some form of justice work are kind of seen as really progressive or something at the minute, by more conservative folks, and yet if we get truly conservative and go back to the Old Testament, like we just see that God has always been on the side of the widow and the orphan and the stranger and the oppressed. And so it runs through the law of Moses and with Jesus kind of readdressing, giving his like State of the Union speech, if you like, on the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of it invites us into that way of life again, where we have to take care of human beings that are made in the image of God as well.
Mate, I feel like we're just getting started, Stu. I feel like we could go back and forth and just hash this out. I love, though, that there are some really, really good resources that people who want to continue this dialogue beyond the podcast can actually get into. Is there? So you've got the e-course and the book, the film, the album.
Yes. So it's a book, film, album, artwork, podcast, e-course, and everything is on the e-course. So you only need to go to one place, which is thebeatitudesproject.com.
Yeah.
And everything is there. If you can stream the music and the albums at your normal kind of streaming services, but everything is on, like the film and the book and everything is up on the e-course. So.
Oh man, that sounds phenomenal. Are there any more like final thoughts or things that kind of come to your mind? That's been on your mind lately that you want to share, or? Yeah,
actually, I think that we spending a lot of time kind of being confronted by all kinds of different news, and it's very easy to be saying, certainly as a follower of Jesus, to say, well, it would be great if my leader or my government, if would model this lifestyle of Jesus. Like it'd be great if they changed and did this. And then you can kind of take it a step down and say, well, it'd be great if my pastor or my church leader or my local mayor or something, like what if they followed this way of living that lines up with this upside down way of living in the Sermon on the Mount. But then I think the most important question is to say, well, what about me?
So like good. I love that.
What if I changed? Like what if I lived a certain way that was full of empathy and full of compassion and full of love for neighbor, where I was actually hungry and thirsty to see righteousness and justice break out in my home and in my online life, or in my town, and because I think that everyone, if you had that conversation with them, everybody wants to make a change. Everybody wants to do some good in the world. But we just don't know where to start. And so I think that some of the keys in the Beatitudes and in the Beatitudes project can actually help us find an on-ramp into living a different way. That's what I would say is like, how do we actually live differently and not just put that onto everybody else?
That, well said, Stu. Yeah, it reminds me this week, by the time this probably goes to air, it's probably going to be a few weeks, but it reminds me of a conversation I had with my wife, and we sat down and we're like, well, we've just moved into a new neighbourhood here in Australia, and we've got this work that is in another community, another town in Toowoomba, a couple of hours away, that are helping these refugee families that we're a part of. But I thought, what am I doing in my street, in my neighbourhood? Like, can I get it down, even zone it down? And so we've sat down and we're organising a street party to bring everyone on our street. I mean, we've come to this neighbourhood and we're fortunate to have like a bit of a kind of cul-de-sac kind of street community, and you just find that you're waving to people all the time, and you rarely get the opportunity to really sit down and put this into practice in as smaller kind of community as your own street that you live on. And so we're really looking forward to getting the barbecue out, making some Aussie tacos, some sausages and bread,
nice,
and bringing everyone together. Bring a plate, and I'm looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have together. Just out on the street, kids playing, talking, realize that, hey, we didn't choose who we got, who our neighbours were, and we probably all got lots of different stories and backgrounds, but I think even to put into practice something like, well, my expectations for other people out there to be making all these changes, but how can I do it in my sphere, my world? They're the real practical, little things that are really important. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it kicks off okay. But Stu, it's been great. I've got one more question. Before we'll actually, if you don't mind, I'll take 5 minutes on the end for a bit of a bonus round, quick fire questions that I give to some Patreon guests. So you won't get that if you're listening to this right now, unless you're a Patreon. But the last question I have for you is, I want to finish on positive. You're married? How many years have you been married now for, Stu?
36 years.
Yeah,
believe it or not.
You must be a grandfather by now, right?
Yeah, I've got two daughters, and I've got two daughters who have grown up, and one of them is married, and they have children. We've got two little grandchildren, 5 years old and a year and a half.
Yeah,
and they're amazing girls. So loving life, and so we've recently moved house, and so I've got a studio in the basement, which is where I'm sitting now. So I spend time writing songs and playing guitar for different people here. When in a non-COVID world, I tour as Michael W. Smith's guitar player. So we tour all over the country and all over the world. Doing that, and I love that. And just heading back full circle to Delirious, how I approach my life now is that when I have an opportunity to get on a tour bus or an airport situation where we're flying, and I'm going to be able to play guitar, I'm just like a little kid in a candy store again. I love it.
I could imagine.
Because I thought it was over at one point. And so I'm so grateful to be able to still do that.
Wow, that's so cool. And I love watching you on Instagram, your the little behind the scenes guitar kind of licks that you show, and the different ways you take us behind the scenes, and some of your older stuff and some of your newer stuff. It's really, really cool. But as you're kind of looking, right, so you're on this, the horizon. You're looking forward. You're looking at the world that your little grandchildren are going to grow up in, and what gives you hope in this, even in the midst of, there's a lot of injustice, and we really need to sit with the suffering and the poor and the pain, as we've been talking about. But what gives you hope as you look forward?
Humanity gives me hope. I think that human beings are just the most amazing things on the planet. And I know there's a lot of evil being done, but I kind of think that before original sin, there was original grace. And I think that I think humans are essentially good. And I think that we can all dig and find goodness. So, like, for instance, with our grandchildren, there are moments, like, people ask me, what is it about having grandchildren that is great? And I would say, without hesitation, that it's the amount of joy they bring. And they haven't learned that. You know, they just are. They're just kids, you know. And so if we can get in touch with the thing that makes us kids, you know, as we get older, like the naivety and the fun and the honesty.
Yeah.
You know, kids give me hope.
Wow. Thank you, Stu. This has been so much fun. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, it's great.
Sharing your heart.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you. Wow. It's what gives us purpose, like you were saying earlier, right? It gives that sense of purpose and meaning and joy, and it takes everyone. It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Stu.
All right. Thank you.
And so that wraps up our two-part conversation with Stu G from Delirious. Now, for me, it was a highlight to have Stu on the podcast. As a kid growing up, Delirious was one of my favourite bands, and so it was just amazing to be able to talk with him. Now, we do have more of a conversation that is only accessible if you become a Patreon of the show. Now, that's just becoming a supporter financially, and you can do that for as little as $5 a month. You can support the show and get access to all this behind-the-scenes content and bonus episodes with all of the guests. Just go to patreon.com/Justice Matters and you can learn more about how you can do that. Also want to let you know as well that any moment now, I will be jumping out of a plane for You Belong. Now, we are doing a fundraising event and we've got stacks of people that are going to be jumping out of planes to raise much needed and important funds for the work of You Belong in helping refugees to integrate and thrive here in Australia. And if you head over to mycause.com.au, you can learn how you can be a part of sponsoring myself or anybody on the team. We've got refugees, we've got a 12-year-old girl, we've got other team members of You Belong jumping out. Get behind somebody and help us raise the funds that we need to continue the incredible work that we're so proud of doing. Now we get to the point in time of the podcast where I like to thank those who make it possible. And I'd like to start by thanking those that provide the music. Now that's John Art and David Gungor. They're known as the Brilliants. And they give us the music that we use on this podcast. Thanks, guys. As always, I'd like to thank Jose Biotto, who is the audio-visual engineer, who does an incredible job. He is a master, I have to tell you. And I wouldn't have this show if it wasn't for him editing and filming and doing all the fun audio stuff that I know nothing about. And lastly, if you're enjoying listening to this podcast, guys, would you do us a huge favor and help us by rating it? Wherever you're listening, you can give us a 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, or you can follow us and subscribe to us on YouTube. Spread the word. We love doing this, and we want to have more conversations, and we want to still be able to do it. And let us know by leaving a comment as well, or a review. We want to know ways that we could improve. Guys, let us know that you're enjoying it, and we'd really appreciate it. Now it's time for me to sign off. Guys, join me for another episode of Justice Matters. For now, though, I'm your host, Tim Buxton, and thank you so much for listening.